bring to put on the board a chart, J-E-P, etc., because I found that it was in chapter 3, the I am that I am passage. But we will go on for part of the time next time with the Gospel of John, but primarily we will discuss, there won't be time for the other three Gnostic texts there, the most remarkable complete Gnostic text that we have, which may well be by Valentinus himself, and that is the Valentinian Gospel of Truth. The only way of getting hold of it these days is in a so-so translation in a big volume, which I think is double big, and which is now available as a paperback, and it can be found in most bookstores, the Nag Hammadi Library, edited by James Robinson. The crucial text, the one that we'll discuss in relation to the Gospel of John next week, is the so-called Gospel of Truth. We don't really know the title of it. It begins the Gospel of Truth is, and then goes on from there. So we call it that. But the three crucial, more or less complete, they're actually all fragmentary one way or another, ancient Gnostic texts that we now possess because of the Nag Hammadi Library are the other three. And in discussing the Gospel of Truth and its relation, which is a revisionary one, of course, again, to the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, I'd like to be able to call upon certain moments in those other three texts. So the Apocryphon, or secret book of John, 98 to 116 of that volume, the hypostasis, or conception of the archons, they being the negative rulers of things, 152 to 161, and then from a different mode of Gnosticism, so-called Sethian rather than Valentinian, the second treatise, the great Seth, which you'll find there. They are peculiar texts, as you will see. The Gospel of Truth is, I think, the only one which, from a merely literary point of view, really does have considerable power. In any case, that's where we will be next week. And what I would like to do today is begin with the Sinai theophany in the three passages which are clearly J's, and which really burn quite away from the surrounding context, which is mostly the priestly author or revisionist, but to some extent Elohistic. And they are, if you're using the edition that I'm using of the Torah here in the American Jewish version, they're on pages 132 to 135, 141, 142, 157, 164, I'm sorry, dear. 132 to 135. Sorry, my dears. 141 to 142, 157 to 164. I sort of slur over it because we're about to do them in sequence and definitely discuss all three of them. And then I would like us to look at, and let me list them now. I'm sure we will get to this before we finish today. But I tend to fall into sand traps when I'm discussing the J writer, so who knows how far I'll get. But one should not leave the J writer without looking at what really do seem to be the ends of his text, which are not to be found even in Numbers, but the Deuteronomist absorbed them. The book of Deuteronomy, book 31, verses 14, 16, and 23, and chapter 34, verses 1, and then there's a 1b, which is added on, which is the Deuteronomist, and then 2 to 6 are definitely the J writer, and they are his vision of the death at the end of Moses and the burial of Moses. But what I would like us to do in the next hour and 3/4 or so is begin with that extraordinary account. I think it is the most startling passage. And in him it was continuous pretty clearly, and you can even see how it links up in spite of the enormous interpolations here. But begin with the account of the Sinai theophany as given by J. Pass very briefly to his account of the final aspects of the career of Moses, and then I hope at least look at the juxtaposition between the extraordinary revision, which is before Abraham was I am, in its context in the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John, to that passage which is certainly J's in the first place, but which, as I said last time, we only have now in an Elohistic redaction, Exodus 3, verses 13 to 15. So I'm paused now in front of what we now call the 19th chapter of Exodus, where, as I said, pages 132 to 135, that is to say, all of chapter 20, with only a minor interpolation or two, are J's. And in chapter 19, the first verse and the first half of the second verse are P. Then J takes over at 2b, 7 to 15 is his, 18 is his, 20 to 25 is his, probably the whole of 20, which is a unit, is his, and then we will pick them up again on page 141. And again, the immediate problem to deal with, and I will read Jay's portions of 19 aloud immediately, the problem to deal with is the overwhelming problem, not just of the way in which the Elohistic redactor and then even more the priestly writer have to some extent nullified this by context, so that we find it, I think, very difficult to disengage it now, but how peculiar it is in itself. So I pick up now, I'm on page 132. I'm in the J writer, starting with 2b. They entered the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in the wilderness. Israel encamped there in front of the mountain. And now I pick it up from verse 7 on, which is most certainly J, carrying through to 15. Moses came, I'm at the bottom of page 132 now, Moses came and summoned the elders of the people and put before them all the words that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered as one, saying, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses brought back the people's words to the Lord. And the Lord, and that's undoubtedly that Adonai is redaction. In Jay's text it would have been Yahweh, so I'll read it that way. And Yahweh said to Moses, I will come to you in a thick cloud, in order that the people may hear when I speak with you, and so trust you ever after. It's a very puzzling sentence if you brood about it. I will come to you in a thick cloud in order that the people may hear. The transposition of the senses is something that I think we have to talk about. Then Moses reported the people's words to the Lord, and the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. And that purity evidently is intended to be sexual, in a rather curious sense. Very odd, I think, for the J writer, but it certainly is the J writer. Let them wash their clothes. But there is a problem here, because the 15th verse is his, but not what comes directly after it. But to go back to this, stay pure today and tomorrow, let them wash their clothes, let them be ready for the third day, for on the third day, speaking of himself, in the third person, Yahweh will come down in the sight of all the people. He will be seen on Mount Sinai. You shall set bounds for the people round about, saying, beware of going up the mountain or touching the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be either stoned or shot. Beast or man, he shall not live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up on the mountain. Moses came down from the mountain and gives them the instruction. Then comes a priestly interpolation, and then you get that extraordinary and violent 18th verse. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, for the Lord had come down upon it in fire. The smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. Then an interpolation, quite possibly Elohistic, and then 20 to 25, unmistakably Yahwistic in style. Yahweh came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain. Yahweh called Moses to the top of the mountain. Moses went up. The Lord said, Yahweh said to Moses, go down, warn the people not to break through to the Lord to gaze, lest many of them perish. Notice, not all of them, many of them. The priests also who come near the Lord must purify themselves, lest Yahweh break out against them. Moses said to Yahweh, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai. That is to say, you're contradicting yourself. For you warned us, saying, set bounds upon the mountain and sanctify it. So Yahweh said to him, go down and come back together with Aaron, but let not the priests or the people break through to come up to the Lord, to myself, lest he break out against them. Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. And then, of course, you have the extraordinary proclamation of the commandments. And as I say, except for a few interpolations, I will not read it aloud. The whole of the 20th chapter is unmistakably the Yahweh. but I don't think we are going to brood on the commandments. I want us to brood upon what we have so far, what I've read aloud in chapter 19. What does one do with the basic contradiction of it? I mean, that it follows a pattern that I've talked about before, which I think is endemic to the Yahweh of the J writer, which is to give and then take away. To say in this case, I will manifest myself, as the Hebrew makes plain, in full sight of all of them, but to also prescribe the notion of the possibility of touch, and by implication even, the question of the danger of sight, and yet not himself, I speak now of Yahweh as the himself, not himself realize or remember the full implications of what he's saying, so that Moses himself and the Moses of the J writer, as I've said before, and as you will notice for yourself if you contrast these passages to the passages around them, is a much less self-assured and confident figure than the Moses of the subsequent writers. Moses himself, ever fearful, the Moses of J, points out to Yahweh that there is a contradiction involved, that this is in the highest degree deliberate, because it follows so familiar a pattern, so much to be expected on the part of the J writer, is I think a good starting point for his version, which must be the original one so far as we know, of the Sinai theophany. What is one to make of that? What kind of problem of interpretation is that involved? That Moses should realize that this is a contradiction, but that Yahweh does not know or realize or care to remember that it is a contradiction until he is reminded of it. That Moses should have the memory, which doubtless does come from trepidation, that Yahweh does not, and then something which I find even more peculiar, from surely any interpretive point of view. Does Yahweh speak in this passage as though the possibility of the mix between the incommensurables, himself and the people, being potentially harmful or even possibly murderous for large numbers among them, not necessarily, or does he speak of it as though it is necessarily in or under his control? This is a question of the interpretation of rhetoric and of that phrase, which is quite properly translated here several times, the verb breaking out. Breaking out. A suddenness, a sudden kind of a violence. Is he saying that I am so unpredictable that I may not be able to remember myself in time? That I am, as it were, not in sufficient control of my own nature? Nothing could be less normative, of course, and there is no such moment in the Elohistic or the priestly or the Deuteronomist or any, or let alone later when the tradition becomes fully normative. But there is no question that it is present in this passage. How could one handle that? What are the problems that I'm trying to evoke for you? Or rather, that the text surely does evoke for you. You have a Yahweh who speaks confidently at the start of 19. You have the declaration that, which is between, let's say, the 8th verse is, after all, Yahwistic. All the people answer as one saying, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Then come the warnings for the purification of the multitude on the part of Yahweh. But then the warning, no touching, but evidently the promise that Yahweh, speaking himself in the third person, will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. But then the 18th verse, which is of astonishing power in the J original, but the literal translation really catches it. It's a line, it's a verse full of extraordinary intensity. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, for the Lord had, or Yahweh had come down upon it in fire. The smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. And then straight on in the text, because the interpolation of the blare of the horn there is not his, Yahweh came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain. Yahweh called Moses to the top, And then the extraordinary warned the people not to break through to the Lord to gaze, lest many of them perish. That's flat contradiction of saying, I will come down on the side of all of them. They have accepted this. That is therefore covenantal. Let the priests also must purify themselves, lest Yahweh break out against them. It's an extraordinary verb there. It really does mean, in effect, before I myself quite know it, I will have flamed out against them. But Moses said to the Lord, reminding him, people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set bounds upon the mountain. He really is puzzled, and you hear the puzzlement in the Hebrew. And sanctified, so Yahweh said to him, go down, come back together with Aaron. Let not the priests or the people break through to come up, lest he break out against them. And only then the statement of the commandments. Enormous problem in interpretation. But on the basis of some of the things that at least we've been trying to do in previous weeks, let me hear some attempt at getting at this.
Using the power of God throughout Exodus on the doing of Moses, so in the system of that there's a conduit between God and Moses, and that anyone within the relative sent the Spirit, so that the heat from the wire and when the tower is directed towards Moses, and that is the Sinai place, or the means by which power is going to be demonstrated through Moses, that God's power is so great that
the second part of that, I think, is right, not the first part.
People seem to
that conduit is not between them at the beginning, clearly, as in some of the passages that we looked at. And the conduit does not come until the ascension with Aaron. And when it does come, though, it comes in a curious form, because perhaps this can't be answered without going on. Let's cross up, because the second half of what you say is certainly right. Look at page 141, because you don't begin with the Yahwehs again until the 24th chapter, where the first two verses are J, verses 9 to 11 are J, and 12 to 15a are J. Then Yahweh said to Moses, come up to Yahweh with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel. So there are going to be quite a batch of them, and Baolo from afar. But only Moses shall come near the Lord. The others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him at all. So it's becoming, and remember, the intervening chapters are not there. They are interpolations. And indeed it is interpolation now until you get to 9. Then, and that will take you from 9 to 11. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, I'm on page 142, and 70 elders of Israel ascended. And then an extraordinary verse, and they saw the God of Israel. No question about it. And here is the description, remarkable for the J writer even. Under his feet there was the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky of purity. Now why give that visual detail? Is a considerable puzzle. Yet he did not raise his hand against the leaders of the Israelites. They beheld God, and they ate and drank. They sit there in his presence, because you do not eat and drink in this tradition standing up. They squat there in his presence, and in full sight of the Lord, their eyes evidently dwelling on what he stands upon, presumably out of reverence. Presumably they can steal glances at the rest of him, whatever that means. They ate and they drank, and then it certainly does begin again in the sequence starting with 12. Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, and I will give you the stone tablets, the teachings and the commandments. So they arise, and he says to the elders, wait. And then when Moses had ascended the mountain, the cloud covered the mountain, and it breaks off again. And then when you reach 25, you are dealing with interpolation. Then go to 157 and you pick up J again, and it gets very surprising. In 32, 1a is the Yahweh, and then the sequence from 4b to 6, and then the sequence from 15 to 20, and then the long sequence from 25 to 35, which is, of course, the famous episode of the golden Kaf, and then all of chapter 33 and 34 are the J rider, and then that takes you down to 35, and the J rider ends his account of the Sinai Epiphany with this, which I want to read aloud, because starting with 35, the priestly rider takes over. Verses 34 and 35 are, so far as J is concerned, the end of the Sinai Theophany or Epiphany. Whenever Moses, top of page 164, went in before Yahweh to speak with him, he would leave the veil off until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, the Israelites would see how radiant the skin of Moses' face was. Moses would then put the veil back over his face until he went in to speak with him. Don't you remember the very famous, and I think in the end derogatory revision of that St. Paul makes, which I haven't asked you to read? His extraordinary, as I would say, misreading or revision of that trope of the veil of Moses. What's your? No, but it may relate to that. No, he says, and we are in this, dwelling always in the sight of the Lord, not like Moses, who put a veil over his face to hide from the Israelites the fading splendor, which is, of course, exactly the reverse of what this text plainly says. Now, clearly it was a text which worried Paul a great deal, if he needed a misrepresentation which actually reversed what it is saying. What then is it saying, though? What evidently was the disturbance for a writer like St. Paul in it, or what might be the disturbance for us now? And there's a good deal still to survey of the theophany, the whole, the sequence from 157 to 164. But what about this particular aspect? Why, after all, is Moses veiling himself? He leaves the veil off when he goes into the Lord. It's almost as though he acquires a tremendous case of sunburn again. When he came out and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, they would see how radiant the skin of his face was. Then he puts the veil back over his face until he went in to speak with him. So it is shown, it is flashed, as it were, to the throng after he comes back from each colloquy with Yahweh. They see the effect, but they are not meant to see the effect in a continuous way, and clearly not because it fades, but for the notion that even the reflection will be excessive with them. It raises, two questions anyway, and one we still haven't begun to deal with. One which is, why is it that as he sets up the Sinai scene, Yahweh is self-contradictory in J's account of him, first insisting that a sight of him will be granted to the whole of those who make the covenant with him, and then saying no. And when he is reminded that he has given the warning, he agrees, yes, I got it right in effect. The second time, not the first time, and then gives that strange warning of, let them not try to break through to the sight of me, lest I break out against them. That is to say, the impetuosity involved in them is, as it were, theomorphic. To go back to my notion of, I'm not calling this anthropomorphic, but theomorph. That is to say, they may emulate something of my own hastiness and zeal, something of my own tendency to be too abrupt, and that in turn will cause me a further abruptness, and that will be destructive, not necessarily for all of them, but for a great many of them. I go back to the question of the purpose of the writer, always so difficult in the case of the J writer. What is one to do with this? The problematic that it opens up immediately, of course, is what becomes the deepest problematic about the whole of the Hebrew Bible, and what I think we will be using again and again as a clue to Freud. I begin to believe that the most Jewish thing about Freud, not so much normatively, but in terms of his deepest relation to Jewish tradition, is that the strangest aspect of the theory of repression is its insistence upon what Freud calls an Urverdrängung, a primal repression, which means simply, and repression is a bad translation, an estrangement or flight from forbidden representations which would otherwise fulfill the aim of a drive. An estrangement or flight which takes place before there is anything to flee from or be estranged from. That is to say, there is, according to Freud, repression before there is anything to be repressed. Hence it is or primal. That can only be if there is something about the nature, and after all, what is being repressed in Freud is always a representation. It is an image, a memory, a desire. There is something, therefore, for Freud about the nature of representation itself, which evidently, in some primordial human way, causes some mode of anxiety. There's nothing in Greek tradition that supports such a notion, and it is indeed a sophisticated and strangely displaced version, beyond any doubt, of the normative Hebraic tier of representation, what one can call the anti-iconic, going back, of course, to the second Commandment. Now, the Commandments doubtless existed before J, but presumably not in the form in which he writes them down, and his is the definitive form because the normal tradition from the Elohistic later on does not change them. If J is not so much an anti-iconic writer as he is a non-iconic writer. He's interested in dynamism, he's interested in speed, he's interested in motion, he's interested in the auditory, he's not interested in the visual. That may have something to do with the way in which he transformed Hebrew poetry into Hebrew prose, if, as certain recent scholars strongly suspect, and I think they're right, that he is the first real writer of Hebrew prose, rather than that heightened prose, which might be the only Hebrew equivalent of verse. That he has made a major change in genre and convention, the better perhaps to cut himself off from the nations, in the ancient literature of the nations. What does the anti, or rather the non-iconic, because I do not believe that the J writer is anti-iconic, in spite of his phrasing of the second Commandment. After all, it is not anti-iconic, it is even non-iconic, it is iconic. To bring what would they be? 74 human beings headed by Moses, put them on the side of Sinai, and have Yahweh reveal himself to them for the whole time of their eating and drinking a meal while they stare at him, and then to give that extraordinary detail of that pavement of blue sapphire under his feet. It is an icon, and nothing but an icon. The normative aspect of Judaism, perhaps the direct prophet, as being indeed the prophet Ezekiel, who is certainly the figure in the exile who stands behind the formulations of Ezra and Nehemiah and the men of the great synagogue when they come back and rebuild the nation, and rebuild the city, and rebuild the faith. And yet, his book, as you know, begins with an extraordinary vision of the Merkavah, or chariot, of Yahweh's throne in motion, with an enthroned man upon it. That extraordinary vision of what translated from the Hebrew is called the wheels and their work. Really the image of a series of hubs, one inside another, in rapid motion. The Hebrew, the Galgal, is a very strange kind of a Hebrew in Ezekiel at that point, and no doubt reflects exilic notions of various kinds. But that is, of course, nothing but a vast iconic representation, and there it is at one of the fountain heads of the normative. That is a puzzle, but that is a latter kind of a puzzle. One is back in the J text. If he is non-iconic rather than anti-iconic, in spite of the anti-iconic, the anti-idolatrous nature of the second commandment, which is being uttered in just this context, I think still the clue to the whole Sinai theophany or epiphany is in that opening moment. Yahweh contradicts himself, according to the J writer. Moses catches up the more fearful part of the contradiction. The second half reminds Yahweh of it. Yahweh agrees. Yahweh implies very strongly, using the same verb for the people's possible action and for his possible reaction, that kind of element of strong curiosity, of excessive desire to speak and to react to a sight, may govern him also, and this may be too fearful for the people. The implication is perfectly clear that he himself would not be able to restrain himself. That there's just enough self-knowledge for that. And then follows this curiously truncated vision in which only the holiest, presumably 74, it's a rather large number, mount up the side of the mountain, and each entering in his presence. And then the curiosity of the text, which is worth looking at that point, I think, once again very closely, before going on to the latter part of it. Now, where was I at that point? I'm on page 142, and there it is, verses 9, 10, 11. Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 elders ascended. They saw Yahweh. Under his feet there was the likeness, the similitude of a pavement of sapphire, like presumably the blue of the sky in its purity. Yet he did not raise his hand against the leaders of the Israelites. Though leaders is a very strange word there, and is undoubtedly mistranslated, as Orlinsky admits in his B note at the bottom of the page. It is an ambiguous word, and I don't know how to translate it. They beheld God, and they ate and drank. Well, can one resolve the contradictions of the Testament? That they are delivered is perfectly clear. They seem to follow a pattern.
It seems one does get the idea that it's showing here that Kohath is very dangerous, and that
Has it been dangerous before this in the J-Rider?
no, but here it does seem because he's almost saying that, as you said, that something, if they get too near or they look too hard, that something bad might occur.
If they look at all following too abrupt a movement towards it, might be closer to the literal force of it. But it's interesting, you're bringing up the earlier part of it. There certainly has been a change in the stated attitude of Yahweh within the J text. In the encounters with Abram, and then when he becomes Abraham, there is not the slightest suggestion of anxiety about a direct vision, which indeed transcends Abraham as a particular observer who seems after all to govern the whole of his camp, as in the episode at Mamre. The various epiphanies which are made to Jacob are a little more mediated, but nevertheless they do not seem to carry with them any notion that what is involved is going to be destructive. There's also the complication of that wrestling match which we went over last time, because whether or not that particular angel is a bad translation, the word malach or messenger, does not occur in the passage. Simply one of the Elohim is all that the original gives. One, a nameless one, someone who cannot be named or who will not name himself among the Elohim, almost certainly not Yahweh himself, though there is something of an ambiguity there. But of course, the face-to-face encounter, and two men or two beings cannot wrestle without a tremendous degree of face-to-face confrontation, has in it no notion that sight can in any way be a danger to Jacob. It is not the appearance of Yahweh at any point, whether at Babel or at any other point, or even when malachs, when messengers or angels go up against Sodom, which creates havoc. But in the theophany, in the scene at Sinai, J's Yahweh has undergone a change, or is undergoing a change. And I think it does have something to do with what is for J, the surprise of the second commandment. A very curious commandment in in terms of the kind of matter that you have had coming forth from him until this time. Now, is there something anti-iconic about the passage as I just read it aloud there on page 142? The most particular detail we have is under his feet, and there's no sign whatsoever that the text has been disturbed, that there is a redaction in words. There's every reason to believe this is the J text as it would have been inherited even by his own contemporaries. Is it an evasion on his part?
Yes, it seems to be, because it says when they saw God, but there is no description of
but he's not described God earlier, and there's no description, you will remember, this is a very important point. Auerbach's essay uses Elohistic text, but what he had to say in that chapter of the book Ruminates is far more true even of the J writer. There's no description. We do not know what Abraham looks like. We don't know what Isaac looks like. We don't know what Jacob looks like. We don't know what Joseph looks like, except that evidently he is very good to look at. Indeed, the basic technique that the J writer seems to have bequeathed to everybody who came after him, and I do not believe, and it has been disproved in the course of a long argument between scholars as to whether or not this has something to do with the way the Hebrew verb works compared to the way the Greek verb works. This really, I think, is a question of what I would call facticity. The basic way in which the J writer understood the way anything looked was to describe how you would make it, which sounds very odd, I think, to us indeed. Thus, for instance, you may remember in his account, as well as the Elohistic account, of the building of the ark, you're never told what the ark looks like. You're told how you would go about making that ark if you were going to make a replica of it. The result is that when in the book of Kings afterwards, you have a description of the Temple of Solomon, you're not told what the Temple of Solomon looks like. You're not told in the priestly author parts of the Exodus saga what the ark looks like. The ark is evidently of not the slightest interest to J, but is of overwhelming interest to the priestly writer. This is to say, J's notion of what anything looks like is dynamic. How would you go about making a simulation or a replica of it? How would you put it together? That's something very difficult for us to get over into our mode of thinking. In this respect, at least, we all of us come wholly out of the Greeks and out of the Hebrews. We have a visual aesthetic. Homer is a very visual author indeed. He will describe what the Trojan horse looks like. He will tell you what Achilles looks like. He will tell you what Aphrodite looks like. He will tell you at some length what Athena looks like. He will describe a shield, as in one great and famous passage, so that you can never forget that particular shield. A Hebrew writer, because of the J writer, I'm convinced that the example he set will describe a shield only if it's a question of telling you how the shield was made and how a similar shield could be put together. How might one relate that? Because that's the largest clue I know to what you have here. How would one relate that, say, verse 10, there on page 142? And they saw the God of Israel. Now, no statement of what they saw. And quite apart from it, and there is no punctuation in the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, which itself is a version because it adds the vowel points which the original text could not have had, does not give you punctuation. But obviously there is some sort of a break there. And they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there was the similitude, the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky of the purity. Something very curious about that, isn't it? That seems to be a sort of portable stand, because he is standing, the Lord God has come down from the top of Sinai and is standing on the mountainside, where the elders have climbed up to him. Something about the action of his feet has brought the purity of the sky down, so that in effect he stands on a reversal. He stands on the purity of the sapphire look of the sky. And only that is given you as a clue to his visual appearance. But there is no suggestion whatsoever that they did not see him, and yet there is this suggestion, because the same word is used for purity here, though it is a reference to the sapphire pavement and to the similitude of the blue sky, as is used for the notion of those who shall not be defiled in coming to see me. And so in one of those funny word plays of the Yahwist, what kind of brutal irony. Yet he did not raise his hand against the leaders of the Israelites. They beheld God, and they ate and drank, though certainly they could not have been as pure. They did not come up to the purity of the very ground upon which he stood. Now, of course, Yahweh in J has always had a peculiar interest in his own stance. Watch out, he says to Moses in their first meeting at the burning bush, because the ground wherein you stand is holy ground. This ground that I've stepped upon is incommensurate for you. Be careful. You cannot step on this. He's standing there in a reversal. He's standing on the sky. What does one do with that? I'm coming down almost too hard on this, as it were. But it's all we have got. And one needs it to explain two very puzzling matters. One, the whole question, and it's very complicated, because I haven't asked you, to disengage in advance, but that's deliberate on my part. I'm relying on a kind of shock value by first reading it as a connected narrative with all its repetitions, and then having the J kernel of it cut off from the rest. One suddenly sees that the rest is a mollifying context, which to a considerable degree has taken away strangeness, originality, shock, and indeed something which goes beyond that because it cannot be assimilated. Now, what is at least non-iconic here, if not actually anti-iconic? I don't think anti-iconic would be right. Or, to use a Freudian way of talking about it, to what extent could we talk about an estrangement, a flight from, to use that trope of flight, which according to Freud is always the trope of the dreamland? To what extent are you dealing with a flight from representation here, or an evasion of representation? Since the only detail that you get is where and how he stands, that he seems to have brought the heavens down and to be standing on the heavens. And then one remembers something else, the curiosity of this God, who never once in J does what he does later on in the other writers. He will never stand up or sit up in heaven and make a covenant from there. He will come down. He is curious, he is abrupt, he makes his covenants in the J writer always on ground level. He comes down to see for himself, even when it is a nefarious business at the Tower of Babel or at Sodom. But he doesn't always bring the sky down with him.
Now in fact, it's too large. It's strange for mankind and his glory.
Certainly the problem of the theomorphic, or for want of a better term, I call the incommensuраteness. But maybe we better talk about that also, because it really has to do with the mode of irony. I remember telling you in that original lecture on tacticity I gave you that Greek irony essentially is based upon saying one thing. Classical irony involves saying one thing and in some sense meaning or foreboding the precise opposite of what you say. That romantic irony, you might in a deep sense call even Germanic irony. And in the broad sense, romantic and therefore modern irony is based upon the more fundamental postulate of there being an immense gap between expectation and fulfillment. But that J's mode of irony is different, because it has to do with bringing totally incongruous orders of reality into close or intimate juxtaposition with one another, and simply letting them flesh, simply allowing them not to harmonize. What I will take out of what you said, and I find it useful, is that he feels the necessity of harmonizing it in the theophany. There on the side of Sinai, for the first time, I think, he draws back to some extent from his own irony and sees it as a problem in representation for the very first time. And why that should be is, I think, worth taking a little more time to explore now. Yes? Yeah, Paul?
Yeah.
Why you shut the door with the bit of noise from us? Yeah, yes.
Look at one aspect of Corey's project was the instructions. Look at these texts. One of the specific texts deal with the strategies that writers have, leaders have, moving, differentiate themselves, populate, and set this boundary between.
So what you're pointing to is the elitism of the passage. It is true. Sure, it is true, and I think that's very useful on your part. It is the first time that Jay has had to address himself to that problem. Until now, there has been direct contact between, particular ancestors of an elite. But now you have, though it is the priestly author, who will have Yahweh demand that you be a holy people. That is not part of the Jay text, that you shall be a nation of priests. That is indeed a pure priestly author. Jay would never have conceived, I think, of such a matter. And indeed, that far back in time, 1,000 years before the Common Era, it would have been a very peculiar notion indeed. But in any case, it is no part of his thing. But I think you're quite right. There is a problem here. What about those who cannot be wary? Only an elite can be wary. Only an elite can avoid the breaking forth. If they break forth, they will simply be over-curious. If there is then an answering movement in a theomorphic kind of a way on the part of Yahweh, his breaking forth will be disruptive to them and will scatter them, to use the verb which consistently the J writer uses for this, as at Babel. And that is what he does not want to do. He has called the hosts together here, or had Moses call them together, in order indeed to give them a name. To confer the name of Israel, which was previously conferred only upon Jacob, upon all who will now take up the covenant and to solemnize it, to make it formal. But I think you do hit on a major difficulty, since it has always been, as Kierkegaard might say, always the question addressed to a single one. He brings that out in Fear and Trembling in relation to the story of Abraham and Isaac. What happens when it is addressed to more than a single one? Then J is self-contradictory. Yahweh himself is self-contradictory. He has two antithetical impulses, as J portrays him. One is to, in effect, say, let everybody come up and have a good sight of me in this moment in which all of them will become Israel. The other is to say, let them not come up. By the way, it is that particular moment in J, which in a deep sense, I think it is fair to say, and this is a considerable remark on my own part, if I say so myself, it's the ancestral moment of what will become not Catholicism, but Protestantism. The principal difference, and I make this as a historical observation, not a Bloomian observation, whatever that is, the principal difference, surely, historically, between a Catholic conception of the Godhead, whether it be, Orthodox Greek Russian on the one side, or the Roman tradition on the other, and on the Protestant tradition, whether it be Luther or Calvin or the sectarists, is that the Protestant God utters a deeply antithetical statement. He says to him or her who would be his worshiper, be like me, and also do not dare to be too like me. That's built very deeply into Calvin and Luther, and even into the sectaries from the beginning. But that is not at all, of course, the burden of the imitation of Christ in the Catholic tradition, where Indeed, the statement is be as much like me as possible, and is never, so far as I know, except in Jansenism or in strange, almost Protestant movements within Catholicism, do not dare to be too much like me. Now, that is a considerable modification of the J writer. The J writer is not having Yahweh saying either of that, because that's inconceivable to him. We cannot be like him. He is precisely what we cannot be like. And we dare not attempt to be like him. And yet he is giving you the seed of what will finally turn into the Protestant antithetical notion of the self-contradictory demand, which I think is at the heart of all the difficulties of Protestantism historically considered. It throws an extraordinary light on Milton's dilemmas, for instance, from a purely literary point of view. Because he is saying in this passage, with Moses trying to puzzle it out, gaze upon me, come close to me, though don't touch me, but in fact, don't gaze upon me. Don't you dare gaze upon me, unless you are very pure indeed, and of the, and we don't know what the word means, the purified, the leaders, the most selected, the most elite, we do not know what it means. It is some curious word only found in the J writer, and therefore I suspect he invented it, and we have lost what it means, because nobody picked it up after him. Nobody uses that particular word again, which is why Orlinsky gives you, the difficulty there with the Ashiva. We don't know who these people are in the sense of what their function is. But if that is the beginning of the deep trouble in Protestantism, and I think it is the textual beginning of it, that doesn't help us perhaps too much in seeing what difficulty it shows in J himself. If the problem of elitism is now rising for him for the first time in his chronicle, after all, everything for him has been, at least as I've been reading it with you, an agon for the blessing. The blessing has been conferred. The agon has evidently been won, or rather now it gets transferred to the people, and hence you get the golden calf episode in him, and you get the story of Balaam and Barak in him, though that will not come until Numbers, so it is no part of our reading. That is to say, the whole agonistic movement is handed over from elite individuals to the host, which, by the way, is why I believe Moses is not so important to him. Nowhere near as important as he is to the Elohim, or to the priestly writer, or overwhelmingly to the Deuteronomists. The book of Deuteronomy is a very powerful text, but except for those two interpolations, which we will be looking at in a little while, there's nothing of J in it, because Moses is an exalted hero in it, and speaks in his proper person, and speaks as a figure, as grand really, as the patriarchs. He cannot, I think, be that in J, because it is at just this point that the agon for the blessing is transferred to the whole of the people, but that raises an extraordinary problem. Those who earlier were involved in the contest for the blessing, those who sought not the foremost place, mark you, but a time without boundaries, are now caught in a particular moment in time. The epiphany or theophany, followed by the wandering in the waste places. There are no guidelines for carrying on the agon in that context, and it is significantly during the absence of Moses and Aaron and the elders, or whatever they are, that these difficulties begin to break out below. In fact, it's simply too great a burden for a mass or a populace, and from that point on, in the wanderings in Numbers, it intensifies in the J writer. It still leaves the problem of the iconic here, whether non or anti. What can we say about that? If I think that guideline is basically right, that the crisis for the J writer at this point has to do with the transference of the blessing to a large grouping. So a contradiction is expressed by his Yahweh. Moses seizes hold of one horn, the lesser horn of the contradiction. Yahweh, caught up in this, learns something from Moses. He seems to reason with lightning speed, something like, yes, I could break forth, and I would not be able to control myself. Therefore, I had better stick to my second statement of it rather than my first. It is as though he himself is realizing that he now deals with a mass rather than with elite individuals, so that the burden of history is perhaps beginning for him also. But that still is the problem, and they saw the God of Israel under his feet. By putting the emphasis on stance again, upon holding ground, and upon a reversal of the height perspective, so that here indeed the above has become the below, what kind of an icon would that be? What kind of a representation would that be? It's a reversal of perspective in which the sky is under your feet, in which in effect the world is turned upside down, is what the trope is saying. You can only see Yahweh face to face, even as your elite body of 74 or so, and as you see him, the world is turned upside down. But there's also a very strange possibility there, which is picked up in certain Kabbalistic writers, which is that in the great theophany or epiphany, they saw Yahweh all right, but they saw him reversed. They saw him standing on his head. That sounds outrageous and grotesque and typically Zoharic to us, but I think it is a legitimate reading of what the J writer is doing. If you or I go through a sudden bewilderment in which we see things upside down, what does it convey to us? If the top becomes the bottom and the bottom becomes the top, what kind of confusion or bewilderment is it for us? It is dizzying, certainly, but it has what special aspect for us, particularly in terms of representation? Yeah, you cannot know where you stand in relation to representation. If you cannot tell the above from the below, then you cannot calculate any span whatsoever. There is a kind of vertigo of vision. And yet, the Hebrew does not exactly convey that. Nothing could be calmer or more confident or direct than, and they saw the God of Israel, which is literally translated. One way of handling it is to pursue the text just a little bit further. So I will start worrying about time in a little while, because I will want to push us on to other texts. But look at the sequence, the latter part of the sequence, which takes one here up through page 164. And look at the passage starting with verse 29 on page 163, the issue of the radiance, because that is icon, and that is a reversed icon in St. Paul. I'm at the bottom of page 163, verse 29 and following. So Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and as Moses came down from the mountain bearing the 2 tablets of the pact, Moses was not aware that the skin of his face was radiant, since he had spoken with him. Aaron and all the Israelites saw that the skin of Moses' face was radiant, and they shrank from coming near him. But Moses called to them. By the way, it doesn't just mean that he's sort of severely sunburnt. He's radiating, is the meaning of the Hebrew there. He is emitting light. He is a source of light, and they shrank from coming near them. Moses called to them. Aaron and all the chieftains returned to him. Moses spoke to them. Afterwards, all the Israelites came near, and it's rather beautifully conveyed. First, the elite comes near, and then gradually, rather frighteningly, the rest creep up. And he instructed them concerning all that the Lord had imparted. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. And then you get that curious text. Whenever he went in, he would leave off the veil until he came out, and he would come out and give you a glimpse of the radiance, then he would put it back on again. What's the relation of that to iconicity? What is the actual commandment after all? By the way, give me the page reference. I am at C at the moment. Where is the actual text of the second commandment? I leaped right over it before. In the 134. Yeah, there it is. You shall not make for yourself the second commandment. The first is, after the proclamation that I, Yahweh, am your God, who brought you out of the house of bondage. First is the crucial one, no other gods beside me. But the second in order is this one. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image, or any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Now that is Jer's text. There's no question as to how it is interpreted throughout the tradition that becomes Nominative. What about itself as literal text? You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image, or any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Is there a necessity for the phrases 2, 3, and 4 after you get the initial one? You shall not make a sculptured image. That seems to be pretty comprehensive. Or any likeness of what is in the heavens above. For the image involved is not drawing, it is clay modeling. It's taking the earth and modeling with it. And of course, what did Jay instantly expect his readers or auditors to remember? Yeah, the initial action, the permitted sculptor, one who forms the tselem or image, a likeness which is in some sense his own image, though that is not wholly clear what tselem means there. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image, therefore means in that sense you will not pick up the clay and do as I have done. And it doesn't seem to me that 2, 3, and 4 are redundant, because first is the comprehensive prohibition, doing what only I did. The next is what you would be doing if you made that. A likeness of what you can see above you, or what you can see around you, or what you can see in the world of the waters. Why should Jay's God say that? That's a hard question. Why should the Yahweh, who we've been seeing, these last few weeks, why should he say that? No difficulty if we look at it, of course, retrospectively. If we look at it in terms of the formulations which we get even 100 years later and have gone on to this day. It is the one major cultural tradition that I know of in the history of the world, which starts out with a bias against representation. That is in itself, of course, extraordinary, and here it is in its original author. And yet clearly something has happened to him, which is, I guess, what I'm trying to convey today. And I want us to go a little further in seeing what has happened to him. If his own conception, or vision, because I don't think he has a conception, if his Yahweh, if his character, Yahweh, his personage Yahweh, that might be the best word for him, as he has been depicting him, begins to undergo the change, the difficulty having to do with whether one's effect is going to be upon a single one, or even a single house, but now a whole multitude. Why would the prohibition of making for yourself, and I think it begins with the notion of don't try to make an Adam after me. Don't try to be too much like me, particularly in the work of creation. That really seems to be the basis of the prohibition. Don't try to make a fresh beginning. My beginning was the beginning. I have prorogued that for myself, as it were. But I do not think that in the earlier portions, which we know as Genesis, remember that the Genesis-Exodus division is not that of the J writer, but those who come after him. But certainly in the earlier part of the prose narrative, as he was writing it, it would have been, I think, out of context. It would have been the wrong kind of surprise for Yahweh. For instance, for Yahweh to have said to Abraham, or for Yahweh to have said to Jacob, do not make for yourself a sculptured image, would have been a waste. It would have been unnecessary. It would have been, as we would say nowadays, an aesthetic blunder. But now, of course, when you are speaking to a multitude, or speaking to a multitude through its representative or representatives, now you make the prohibition, and you set it second. You set it after the prime one, which is, this is me, and nobody else. But then you say that, if it relates as it must relate to the question of a host, if the anxiety of representation does relate to the movement of describing for the blessing from an elite individual or a few individuals. So father, son, grandson, and so on, great-grandson down to Judah, succession to a whole multitude. Why would the iconic suddenly become a part? What kind of belief is it? It's a hard question also.
Well, is it hard to control a huge group where it's when you have a one-to-one relationship, you can really keep an eye on
And yet think that, I repeat, how surprising in the wrong way, what an expressance it would be on the text. If somebody were to come along now and say, we have now discovered that left out of Jay's text was that he threw off in discoursing to both Abraham and Jacob. By the way, don't make this sculpture. Images. It wouldn't work. It would not ring right. Here it rings grimly right. And I doubt it. I doubt that it's the question of, after all.
I mean, that he wouldn't have to.
Well, yeah, but look, if the name that he cunningly gives for himself, and we have to come on to this now in the context of the Gospel of John in just a few moments, if the name that he cunningly gives to himself, or non-name, the substitute for a name, I will be, I will be. I will be when and where I will be. I'm present when I'm present. I'm absent when I'm absent. Now you see me, now I don't. That really seems to be, sure, what Eya must mean. Plump, I'm gone. Plump, I'm there. And it's when I do it and not when you want it. If that is the governing agent, then he can supervise anybody. He can pop up at any moment, and indeed in the J narrative in the camp, he does pop up at the oddest moments throughout the book of Numbers. He is always there. His representation is always there, whether as pillar of cloud or as pillar of fire. He keeps himself before you by icons, by the way, which is troublesome also. In fact, that icon of the cloud, which is so savagely turned by Blake against the Bible, is something worth rooting on if we have time. But so I don't think it's that. It's not a question of somebody getting away with something without his suddenly popping up to see it. It must have to do with the question of just what the blessing is becoming. If the blessing for an individual had to do with his descendants, and had to do with their surviving as descendants into a time without boundaries, so that time is no longer a dilemma. But then you spatialize that, and you put it into a host. Why would the problem of representation suddenly take on a different kind of image? The time of an individual, especially when it is transmitted in terms of generations, is still a very solitary and unique and idiosyncratic conception or apprehension or apperception, you can even say, of time. But if you have a whole host involved in an agon or a blessing which takes you beyond the boundaries of time, then you can have, of course, thousands and thousands of idiosyncratic perceptions of what it means to be foremost not in space, but in time, in overcoming the limitations of time. The strongest element that the blessing could lead to, presumably, and presumably it could be perverted in any number of idiosyncratic temperaments out of any host whatsoever, would be the attempt to subvert a question of presence and absence in terms of the way you yourself will handle your own status in regard to time. So it has something to do with the temporal burden. It has something to do with the fact that the blessing is temporal rather than spatial. Those who would make a sculptured image evidently would be trying to spatialize what is still intended to be purely temporal. But that raises still another kind of a dilemma, because what difficulty would that evoke, even as a partial mode of analysis? I mean, I'm still trying to follow out what looks to me like a strict way of reading J, that in some implicit sense he teaches us as he goes along. But there's a real difficulty in the face of what I've just said. What would it be? By making a sculptured image, by making a representation, by emulating Yahweh and making an atom out of the clay, because whatever you made would be your atom. As you are, Yahweh's Adam, so whatever you make is your Adam. And that, of course, is the whole notion of idolatry and the anti-iconicity of the second commandment, even here in its literal statement. That must be what it means. That is the foundation of it. But what have you done to your temporal status if you have made your own Adam, if you have made your own representation? And why doesn't it apply? This is a more difficult question. Let me add this and then ask that. Why doesn't it apply to the J writer himself and to his narrative, which after all has a considerable iconic basis? Why hasn't he felt some anxiety about this? And so far as I can see, he never feels any anxiety about it. There is an anxiety of representation in the Elohistic writer. It produces, I think, the bad writing or incongruous quality in the story of the near sacrifice of Isaac, where there is an extraordinary difference between the inadequacy of the language, because I'm pretty sure it's substituted for Jay's language, and the extraordinary nature of what is being portrayed. And it does seem to come from what we now call an anxiety of representation on the part of the Elohistic writer, who I think is scandalized by what the J writer was doing in this passage, and what I assume, as I told you last time, must be left out on the basis of the Mamre and Sodom episodes, is a highly argumentative Abraham who says, what's going on here? And, do you really want me to do this? And so on and so forth. That is to say, real resistance. Something surely like a kind of rebellion, which has been, I think, simply lifted out of the text. I don't think it takes much imagination or speculation to do that. But then what about my question? If you make an Adam, you have freed yourself from the temporal to the degree at least that you have taken up a spatial stance rather than a temporal stance. In some sense, why must that be true?
Yes, you're making yourself immortal, and you're creating something which is going to help.
You have made a representation rather than a living person, which will be there, which will be there after you're gone. And to some extent, of course, you have substituted the representation for a direct descendant. So that in some sense, there does seem to be from the start a certain almost fear of oneness, perhaps, involved in this, really speculative on my part. But the more difficult step is the next one. Why doesn't it work for literary representation? I think I remarked to you earlier on, I certainly meant to, it really strikes me as the J writer's greatest aesthetic power. Not to be found elsewhere in the Bible, not to be found in Milton, not to be found in any other author that I know of in Western tradition, is that you don't feel any leap or change in the mode of the narration. And you don't feel any change in the stance of the J writer towards what he's talking about. There's no sudden modification of his language when he passes from discoursing about, in spite of his enormous sense of their incommensurability, which I call an irony because I don't know what else to call it, because we cannot apprehend it except as an irony, and also because he does seem to take a kind of quite grim humor in it in certain passages, some of which we have looked at. Why is there no anxiety of representation for him? Especially since I do not think that you can say that in the latter part of his text, in fact, let's look at what is almost certainly the last of his text. Turn to Deuteronomy. I didn't ask you to read this, but it is here, after all, in the same volume, the 31st chapter of Deuteronomy, verses 14, 15, quite possibly 16, and certainly 23. The Lord said to Moses, I'm on page 383, the time is drawing near for you to die. Call Joshua and present yourself in the tent of meeting that I may instruct him. And there's some question whether the next sentence is or isn't interpolation. But then there's a little bit of a problem about 15. But since the pillar of cloud image earlier is J's, whether or not that's interpolated may not completely matter. But 16, certainly one is dealing with him again. Yahweh said to Moses, "You are soon to lie with your fathers. This people will thereupon go astray after the alien gods in their midst in the land which they are about to enter. They will forsake me and break my covenant which I made with them." Verse 23, Moses charged Joshua, son of Nun, "Be strong and resolute, for you shall bring the Israelites into the land which I promised them on oath, and I will be with you." And then absolutely crucial, the 34th chapter, ending Deuteronomy, where we're not dead sure how much of it is J. We know for sure that 11 and 12 are a priestly addition. It may be that all of the first 10 verses are J. I think I agree with Martin Knopf. If you want, by the way, to get hold of a book which is more advanced than any other, and so I can work out a chart for you, Martin Knopf's N-O-T-H, translated into English, his study of the Pentateuch, the origins of the Pentateuch, is the best place for it, for a single source. But certainly 1b to 5a, 6 and 10, everybody agrees are the J rider. Well, look at this. Moses went up from the steps of Moab, and look at it in terms of the problem of representation. Moses went up from the steps of Moab, and I think this must be how J ended his narrative, to Mount Nebo, to the summit of Pisgah, opposite Jericho. Yahweh showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, and so forth. Yahweh said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have given it to your offspring. I will give it to your offspring." And then a sentence which is the purest J. "I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you shall not cross there." Why? Why? The whole of the normative tradition has not been able to explain why. And then, after the interpolation of 5b, 5a is certainly J. Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died there. And at the command of the Lord, really does seem to be a priestly addition. But 6 is definitely J, and really has the ring of J. Yahweh buried Moses in the valley in the land of Moab near Beth Peor, and no one knows his burial place to this day. Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom Yahweh singled out face to face. And he ends with that, the J rider. And here's a curious note there, because I think with that, the J rider did not care to go on. As far, I think, as he was concerned, what he had to say was over. Well, first, the mystery which normative speculation has done so little with. I mean, it is not as sensational as that attempt on the part of Yahweh to murder Moses for no reason whatsoever. But why is he not allowed to enter? There is no moment of disobedience on his part for which the J text chastises him at any point whatsoever. It always shows him as being cautious. It always shows him as being frightened in the face of Yahweh. It always shows him as pondering deeply and trying to understand kind of the antithetical nature of what has been said to him. But there is no fault. The fault is always in the people throughout Exodus and Numbers, nor does the text of Deuteronomy right down to this point. Nothing that the Deuteronomist writes, nothing that the priestly author or the Elohist before him has written, explains why this choice has been made. I think we can answer it because it simply belongs to something that we've gotten very used to, and what one could call the creative practice of J. But I think one should relate it now to the question of a non-iconic strain, or perhaps the first shade or beginning of an anxiety of representation. Look how it is done. It must be an act of burial in which, if the grave is, how he dies you are not told. In later normative interpretation, a verb used here is interpreted as meaning the famous image of the kiss of death, which God gives to Moses. But however the death takes place, Moses simply disappears. The grave is unknown by any man because only Yahweh is present. And I think for the J writer something is finished. If everything began, if the first act, and I said this before, but I don't know a more important thing to say about the J writer. This is the way he signs himself, it seems to me. If you want his signature, what is idiosyncratic to him, you've got to find it here. The very first thing he does, his first act, is no grand pronouncement as the priestly author, let this and let that. No, just reaching down and grabbing up the handful of dust and beginning to mold that clay and then breathing upon it. The very last act is to take the individual he has beyond question spoken to most directly. Once there was a question of singling out an individual in the face of a throng, rather than an individual in a world of individuals, and he places him back in the earth where nobody else will ever find him, so that there cannot be a grave of Moses or a tomb of Moses. Now that must mean something anti-iconic, of course. Do not have a tomb, do not have a grave, in absolute opposition to the land which you have left, the land of the pyramids and of the necropolis, the land of the cenotaphs to the dead, those who would make much of death. No. God puts him away, and you are not to find him. You cannot make any icon of him whatsoever. The representation of him is vanished. It is not as though he never was, but all that matters about the grave is the reversal of the Adamic act, which is, I think, one clue. It's one thing that led me to saying that the second commandment basically means don't make an Adam for yourself. It must also, I think, finally be don't bury a Moses for yourself, and don't therefore set up a pyramid of any kind whatsoever. And if one thinks of pyramid symbols when they are in Hegel or in Melville or in Shelley or in Derrida, one sees, of course, an iconic tradition be manifesting itself against just this prohibition, though in all kinds of dialectical ways. Then also think of the statements. And I said that before to you also, but it's worth saying again now because it should take on a different kind of an emphasis. If the first statement, the first thing that the J writer ever has Yahweh say is, I give it all to you, except look, you can't eat of that. And the last thing he says is, there it is. I show it all before you, but you shall not cross over into it, because that's the way I do things. That's the way I talk. That's what I am. And that surely has something to do with what the normative would not consider at all. Sometimes I'm there, sometimes I am not there. And I insist upon this kind of absolute whim on my part, because in some sense I cannot help it. This is, the deepest nature of myself as divinity. Now the Deuteronomist and those who worked with him, who put the 5 books in their final shape by adding this, and this is certainly after the exile, because Deuteronomy is almost certainly that book, which in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah is found in the temple wall and is read out to all the people by Ezra the scribe in order to have them rededicate themselves to the covenant. It raises this question also. Where is the iconic present now? Asking you to put together 3 texts, which is not easy. The death and burial of Moses, and why, the unasked and therefore perhaps unanswerable why, but one has to find some answer, why he is not permitted to cross over into the land. It is not evidently punishment. Just as it cannot be a punishment for Adam and Eve to say, I give you the whole garden, I don't give you this tree. Somehow it is, though part of the garden, not for you. I show you the whole land, you shall not cross over into it. Joshua crosses over into it. 1 or 2 other individuals do not die in the wilderness, but cross over into it. The host is punished, but there is nothing to punish Moses for, nor is there any suggestion in the actual J text that Moses is being punished. It seems to be a hedge against representation in each case. It seems to be the embryonic beginnings of what finally will lead to the special version of the second commandment in the J writer. guess I'm now suggesting that the second commandment, though so far as I know, there's no reason to believe that he had not initially formulated it, since it is not a burden to him in the major part of his text, but has to do for him with ends and beginnings. That is to say, origin and end, which Nietzsche so powerfully in his polemic warned us were two things and should never for the sake of life be compounded for one another. Origin and end for the J rider are remarkable because origin and end, alpha and omega, overwhelmingly have to do with the nature of Yahweh. And he does not make a clear distinction between origin and end. Presumably, therefore, the second commandment is there to keep you from refusing to associate origin and end. It is, as it were, an anti-Nietzschean commandment. I'm suggesting now, that even as we might say nowadays, an anti-deconstructive commandment. That is to say, it has a very powerful kind of a force, but not, I think, the force that it picks up in the normative tradition. That is to say, it is not representations ultimately of Yahweh which are feared, because there can always be a reversal. He can, in some sudden rush, stand everything upside down, as he evidently does at that particular moment. He may do it simply in a whoop of exuberance, or he may do it because it actually has some deep design on his part. Well, there's still one large question about the Yahweh. I don't want to spend more time on the Sinai theophany, as though we will come back to the Yahweh in the context. I don't ask you to bring the text of the J Rider next week. I ask you just to bring the Nag Hammadi text and the New Testament. But we will come back to the J Rider and parts of the text in relation to certain moments in Freud, particularly in Totem and Taboo, and also in relation to certain moments in Emerson, certain moments in poetic tradition since Emerson. But before one goes on to a juxtaposition between the I am that I am and before Abraham was I am, so as to introduce what it is that's happening in the fourth gospel in relation to the older text, what about the whole puzzle of why there is no anxiety of representation in the J Rider until, one, the whole question of the blessing being possessed by a whole multitude is introduced, and two, until the question of ends. For instance, it was thought earlier by certain scholars that parts of the book of Joshua were done by the J Rider. Recent scholars don't think so. It's my reading of the original text. They are not. He writes the incident of Balaam and Balak, which is a remarkable and very funny incident involving adopting a reverse blessing, a person which becomes a blessing for the host of Joshua in Numbers. And then he passes from that to the account of the death of Moses, and the Deuteronomist takes that and uses that to his own purposes, though maybe subverts what is happening there for his own purposes. But that there is a darkening in him, seems to me unmistakable. For the blessing is universalized, the Yahweh is troubled. Can one return that to the context that he writes it? And I remember talking to you a little bit about that last time, even though that was 2 weeks ago, since we had the break in continuity, and a little bit when I introduced him to the week before. We know, almost certainly, that he is writing towards the end of the reign of Solomon. We know, therefore, that in his lifetime and the lifetime of his own father, whoever that was, there had been a radical transformation in what could be called the culture of Israel. There had been an enormous transition, an enormous urbanization, an enormous urban sophistication, something of a cultural renaissance, if it wasn't indeed a new outbreak totally unlike anything previously in their history. Certainly an accession of enormous power. Certainly a centralized structure of administration for the first time, a national army, rather than just a group of bands who would come together at particular times in particular places at the call of one summoner or another. a movement towards making it rather more like the other major nations and empires of the ancient Middle East, and indeed the most considerable moment, not even to be duplicated again under the later Maccabean monarchs or in the reign of Herod the Great, who after all was a pensioner of Rome, no matter how much land he seizes. The largest moment, certainly not duplicated by the present, perhaps the last illusory strength of the current state of Israel. It occupied, historically, we know this, a chunk of Egypt, a considerable chunk of what is now Jordan, the foothills of what is now Iraq, the whole of what we now call Syria and Lebanon. It was a rather considerable landmass under tight imperial control by the time Solomon had reached even the middle of his reign. I also remember remarking, though this is mere speculation on my part, but it's literary or critical speculation, surely the vision of the possibilities of a human being, whether they be those of Jacob or of Joseph or even of Moses, in the J writer must have something to do with the historical King David, who after all was an ongoing national hero of the moment, not only the father of the reigning monarch, but a comprehensive kind of a human being, someone who perhaps had changed the very paradigm of what a man might hope to be in the eyes of a writer as sensitive and comprehensive as J was. If the shadow of representation, or if the problem of representation enters him when you move from sequence of individuals to a host, what, as we would say nowadays critically, what might that be a trope for, or a warning trope against? What shadow is hovering over him at that moment? Presumably it is the shadow of Solomon, or the difference between David and Solomon. It is certainly the shadow of a sense of future trouble. And by the way, he lives in a realm, and I take it for granted that in its original writing, the second commandment must have been not a normative prescription, but as it were a poet's protest against what was going on all around him. Because we have every reason to believe on the basis of the book of Kings that Solomon had surrounded himself with a vast array of sculpted representation. There is a vast iconicity which is suddenly awake in the land. So I take it that there is a kind of, as there always is in a strong writer, whether it be Shakespeare or the J writer or Freud or any sort of Tolstoy, any strong writer at any moment in history, there is a deep sense of current trouble in this shadow which falls upon him, because clearly the movement from individual to host is a tropological version of the movement from first the world of the tribes or separate entities that had made up Israel, but not as a comprehensive whole, then to the still heroic figure of David, presumably even in the vision of the J writer, with all of his sardonicism, but then the reality of the increasing corruption and the increasing wealth and the increasing imperialism and the increasing representational excess leading in turn to an inner void of the realm of Solomon. That is not just my surmise, that is a mode of surmise that you find in Protestant biblical scholars like Gerhard von Rad and Mo Wimple, and I think they are right. I think it testifies to my own sense of this text. What is original in what I'm saying now, and may or may not be right, but I think there is something to it, is that this shadow, which indeed, as it were, as we would say nowadays, a societal shadow, historical shadow, falls upon the J writer at precisely this point in his work, as he has to open out his account to the account of the blessing being struggled for in terms of its maintenance by a multitude. Therefore, the warning against representation, which surely means tropologically not so much a warning against iconicity as such, but a warning against the movement to the Solomonic kind of a world, to the corruption of the nations, to the corruption of those verse enormities that he was getting away from in the whole of this extraordinary narrative that he was writing. That is one way, it may not be the only way, of explaining why only now, in the crisis of his work and then the concluding portion of his work, some shadow enters for him. He does not wish to show a triumphant Moses. The Deuteronomists wished to show a triumphant Moses, but felt compelled out of reverence for the J text after all having been handed on for the Elohistic and priestly redactors to assimilate it, though he cannot really assimilate it. So that if you read it now in its full place in the text of Deuteronomy, you wonder why the shadow is there. He does not end on a note of triumph, the J writer. And I think that is all important. He ends again on the inexplicable incommensurability of Yahweh and Moses as the representative of the people, and of Yahweh saying, "You shall not cross over there," which is, whether one likes it or not, a kind of repudiation of Moses. Not a total repudiation, just as there is no total repudiation of Adam and Eve, but the distance or estrangement is being put there. And that's the final clue that I have, at least in my current reading of this, because I'm still an amateur, I think, in my reading of this. If the estrangement, if the sense of estrangement or flight or repression, in Freudian terms, in the J writer, comes from the sense of the incommensurability between Yahweh and Adam and all those who come after Adam, then one has indeed, and this is something that will come up very strongly when we deal with the passage from the earlier to the later Freud, the most surprising thing in the difference between the first Freudian theory and the second or definitive one, the one which is being worked out as early as the essay on narcissism and introduction, but does not really culminate into the writing of Beyond the Pleasure Principle and the books like The Ego and the Id and Inhibition, Symptoms, Anxiety, which come after it. The extraordinary change in Freud is the painful, slow birth of what in English translation is called the super-ego, or that which is the super-I, or above the ego, the I. That is just not present in the earlier Freud at all. You can see it struggling up through that curious thing called the ego ideal, and the close of the essay on narcissism, I sometimes think one should call the revenge of Yahweh, because it is related to the whole question of the off-the-drangle, of what it is that causes repression in the first place, why repression or defense is at the heart of Freud's speculation. Finally, the masterpiece of the off-the-drangle is the extraordinary relationship as set forth in the book, strangely translated under the title of the English of Civilization and its Discontents, in the book on the nature of what about culture can it finally bear itself, where you get this extraordinary, really must get on to the gospel, John, you get this extraordinary shadow play in the late Freud. You get a crazy farce in which everybody's superego is perpetually at work tormenting that personage's ego, largely unconscious ego indeed by then. So this whole thing belongs to the realm of the drives, torturing the ego, tormenting the ego in order to make the ego reduce its aggressivity, or at least turn its aggressivity against itself rather than against others. But then here's the diabolical part of it. For every acquiescence on the part of the ego, for every further estrangement from aggressivity, or further turning of aggressivity against the ego itself, the superego, instead of becoming more lenient or relenting, becomes more savage and more severe, becomes more accusatory. And this terrible split and its consequences is the rather frightening story that Freud is telling in various ways at the close. It is not, I think, wholly unlike what the J writer is doing. There are all sorts of fascinating links, but I don't want to explore them, and I do want us in the time we have left today to move to a very different writer. Look at the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John, and what one is relating it to from the start. So I'm going back to where you didn't want me to end last time when I was running for a car, but I wanted to end there anyway, aside from running for the car. Exodus 3, verses 13 to 15, where the language is the language of the Elohist, but the verbal play, as I said, demonstrates that he is redacting the J writer. Moses said to God, page 102, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, Eya Asha Eya, untranslatable. He continued, thus shall you say to the Israelites, Eya, sent me to you. God said further to Moses, thus shall you speak to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, has sent me to you. All right, we have here the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John, and let me take just a few minutes to say something about, good heavens, wait a minute, our time is almost up. At least I want one juxtaposition before I run for my driver. Let's take another 3 or 4 minutes here. I'm a bad reader. Watch this. We know that this text was written late, and we know it was written by a Jewish author. It has nothing to do with the Synoptic Gospels. It is written probably 70 years after they are written. It seems to have been written about the year 100 into the Common Era. 100 Anno Domini, if you prefer the Christian description, 100 years since the advent of our Lord. Written on the coast of Asia Minor by a Koine, a Greek-speaking Jew, for evidently a small conventicle or sect of Jewish Christians, not Gentile Christians, though certainly by that year there were more Gentile Christians than there were Jewish Christians. And scholars have surmised, I think rightly, on the basis of the text of the Gospel of John, 2 things. One, that we have a greatly altered version of an Ur text, or an earlier text, which shows all sorts of traces, some of which I'll talk about next time, of having been much more Gnostic than it has been made into now, much less orthodox. Indeed, the famous formulation at the beginning, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, there's every reason to believe that in the original text that was, and the Word became not sarkis or flesh, but pneuma, and dwelt among us, which would be a Gnostic formulation, and it's not an incarnation, you see, at all. But it is certainly of the 4 Gospels, and I think we'd better face it immediately because I'll be talking about this next time, the most anti-Jewish, precisely because it comes out of the most combative Jewish kind of a context. Its climax is in this extraordinary scene in the temple, starting at about verse 12 of chapter 8, and passing to the taking up of the stones and the hiding of Jesus at the close. And it is the most violent battle between the Pharisees and Jesus in the text of the New Testament. And here is the crucial part of it. It is summed up, and it built up in a dialectic that I'll begin with next time, how gradually you get to the question of Abraham. But let's break into it at verse 51. Truly, I truly, verily, verily, I say unto you, Jesus speaking, if a man keep my saying, he shall never see death. Then said the Jews unto him, now we know that you have a devil. Abraham is dead, and the prophets, and you say, if a man keep my saying, he shall never taste of death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who is dead, and the prophets are dead? Whom are you making yourself into? Jesus answered, if I honor myself, my honor is nothing. It is my Father that honors me, of whom you say that he is your God. Yet you have not known him, but I know him. And if I should say, I know him not, I shall be a liar like unto you, but I know him and keep his saying. And now the crucial part of the colloquy. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it, and he was glad. Then said the Jews unto him, you are not even 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said unto them, truly, truly, verily, verily, I say unto you, and at this point they erupt and start gathering up stones, before Abraham was, I am. What has the writer of John done there? I am that I am. Eya asha eya. Before Abraham was, I am. Why are they as outraged as they are? Well, it could only be said, therefore, by someone who is taking the Godhead onto himself But there's something much more complicated there. Is he not also saying, is not the writer, John, or the person calling him John, also saying, before the Yahweh was, before Moses was, I am. Before you had your text, this text was written. But that's the starting point that we'll use next week, because that is what I think Gnosticism textually is all about. But now we must stop. This is nearly a quarter.